So I'll start using this and then maybe I'll.
Okay.
Thank you, Giovanni, for the wonderful introduction, for inviting me here, for giving me the opportunity to speak with the students of this university. Once again, if everybody can hear me, right? Okay, well, good. So basically, as I understand, I have about an hour and a half total, including the Q&A. It's not an easy task to speak about Georgia and the European integration of Georgia, also in such a short period of time. So I'm going to leave some period in the end for your questions, hoping that the things that you're interested to learn about, I can answer them. But before that, let me just give you a brief background. So one thing that I want to say in the beginning is that when I was in the Foreign Service of Georgia, one of the things I had to do was to negotiate Georgia's association agreement with the European Union. And that was back in 2009, 2011, during those days. And that was for the first time that the European Union at that time decided to view the countries on its eastern frontier as potentially the countries who could then one day become the members. But on that path, obviously, the decision was made to conclude the association agreement. And I remember, so I was the chief negotiator of the political part of the agreement. And I remember negotiating a very interesting thing, including whether we should write in the agreement that Georgia is a European country or not, which is a strange thing to negotiate because either you are it or not. And very often we've heard from the European Commission, which was mandated in those negotiations, that you are the European country, there is no doubt about that, but maybe we shouldn't write it in the treaty. And we were like, why? I mean, what's the point of not writing if you are? In the end, we found a weird compromise. We wrote in the treaty, in the association agreement, Georgia is the East European country. Okay, we said fine. It's probably something similar to the agreement on the North Macedonia name that was struck recently with the Greek. So in any case, so I've been working on the European Union related issues and the EU-Georgia relations for quite a long time. I remember that in 2004, 20 years ago, I was actually the first person who created the whole course on European integration with the European Union, first in the Georgia's education system, basically. And since then, a lot of things have happened. And now I'm actually delighted to recap that and talk about where we are. But maybe before we start, I don't know how well you're familiar of the country that you see on the map down here, on the east side of the Black Sea, to the north of Turkey and south of Russia. It's not a big country, obviously. On this map it's bigger, but so it's a country here with two regions which are occupied by Russia. I'll come back to this later on because that's another important thing that we need to talk about. And it's bordered by Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russia. As you see, the only European neighbor we have is the Black Sea. Because it also shares the borders with Romania and Bulgaria, the EU member states, and nobody else. So some basic info, basically, just to give a sort of background. We're talking about 3.7 million people, which I would say is an exaggerated, optimistic number, with over 1.3, 1.4 million, in addition to these also living abroad, including in the European Union, including in the United States, and also Russia. It's one of those few countries in which a vast majority of people live in the capital, about 1/3 of the people live in the capital, Tbilisi. It's a heavily Orthodox Christian country, with over 85% identifying itself with the Christian Orthodox religion. It's one of those countries where I joke often that Patriarch, the Orthodox Christian Patriarch, is more popular than Jesus Christ because the approval rating of the Patriarch is over 95%, and obviously Christians are only 80-something%. It's not a rich country, it's one of the poorest countries with the nominal GDP being $8,000, but if you do it in a PPP, which is the purchasing power party, GDP per capita is 22,200, which is about 2.5 times less than Italy, and 1.5 times less than Bulgaria, which, as you know, is the poorest country in the European Union. So it shows, sort of compares where we stand in terms of development. However, the GDP growth has been quite big, annually on the average 7.5%, one of the biggest in the whole continent. So when I talked about these issues, Joanne kindly talked about my background. So I used to be in politics, and now I'm in academia, and that means that I'm quite opinionated. So a lot of things I would say even though I will try to be more academic and sort of avoid my personal and political views, which is not always so easy. Now, if you want to look at how Georgia's relations with the European Union have developed, I would call that these were the major stages of development. And once again, we're not in a history lecture here, it's probably going to take us hours to talk about this, but you see actually the periods as I would classify them. This is not an academic or sort of given or acknowledged classification. In the early days, 2004, is what I call the partnership and cooperation phase, where Georgia and the EU basically had the partnership and cooperation agreements. For those of you who study the foreign policy of the European Union, you will know that that is a certain family of agreements in which basically the EU sort of shakes hands with the neighbor country, or not the neighbor country, and says, you know, just agree on the basic principles of cooperation. But that agreement and that sort of state of relations was not based on either heavy assistance or any conditionalities or any sort of push from the European Union to democratize or things like that. It was basically just high level, how are you kind of agreement. In 2004, there's a new stage which took place, and it was linked with the two developments, one inside the European Union, the other one in my country and in the region in general. The one inside the European Union was that the Eastern enlargement happened, and obviously the 10 new countries joined the European Union to the east. And that's also the period of time when the European Union has developed, and I'm sure you've heard of it, the European Union's security strategy in 2003, in which, incidentally, Georgia was not mentioned, or actually it was mentioned in a footnote, where it was said that sort of there's the Black Sea, and on the east side of the Black Sea there's this country which might be interesting for us in one of those days in the future. And then what happened in 2003-2004 is that there were popular revolutions in Ukraine and in Georgia. The Orange Revolution in Ukraine and the Rose Revolution in Georgia, which sort of was a sweep of democratization in these countries, and the former Soviet corrupt regimes were changed with the new generation democratic governments. And that prompted the European Union to open a new sort of relations with the eastern countries, and that's what we call, or the EU called at that time, the neighborhood policy, European neighborhood policy. And that was the policy which encompassed not just Georgia and Ukraine, but basically a whole ring of countries to the east and to the south of European Union. And you see here the red countries, which were the European partners, and then the yellowish countries, which were the Middle Eastern and the Northern African partners. And the European Union at that time decided to, I think the quote from the president of the commission at that time was, Romano Prodi, was everything but institutions. To give these countries, to offer these countries everything but institutions. Which might sound interesting, but was not entirely acceptable for neither for Georgians nor Ukrainians nor Moldoans, for a very peculiar reason, which was that the neighborhood policy envisaged concluding the neighborhood agreements. And neither of these countries wanted to sign up to being a neighbor forever. So that was not really welcomed that much, even though the Eastern Partnership provided the opportunity to these countries, sorry, the neighborhood policy provided the opportunity to these countries to do some reforms. But this is what I call the socialization period, when the EU basically told Georgia, you know, you come up with a list of reforms, the way you want to do it, and we're going to help you, but we're not going to tell you what to do or how to do it. Then the new stage happens in 2009, and that happens after the war of Georgia and Russia. In 2008, there was an invasion of Russia into Georgia over the two regions which are now occupied. I'll come back to this later on. And the response of the European Union to that was drafting a new sort of integration plan for the Eastern partners. And that was called the Eastern Partnership. And it was tailored on those instruments that were used for the Eastern enlargement of the countries like Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, etc. And the idea of the Eastern Partnership was first to conclude the association agreement, which was a sort of a heavier political agreement, to also conclude the free trade agreement, which basically opened the market of the European Union to Georgia, Ukraine, and the other countries, and also to ensure the visa-free regime, so that people would travel without visas. And the fourth one was to basically open the sky, meaning that, you know, you could have the cheap flights, etc., so you could actually become more integrated in that. And so, with the Eastern Partnership, 1914 was the period of negotiation of these instruments, and then in 2014, the implementation of these agreements started. In 2022 comes a new stage, which is the stage coming right after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when the European Union, as you well know and probably remember, because it was not that long ago, everything I talked about it probably quite long ago from your perspective. So in 2022, the European Union's approach was that they would open the door for the Ukraine and also for the countries that were in the same political region with Ukraine. I'm going to stop here for a second. As you know, the European Union enlargements have happened mostly in regional cohorts, so to say. The first enlargement in 1973 was the northern enlargement with the UK, Denmark, and Ireland joining in the region. The second enlargement, even though it was separated in years, was still a southern or Mediterranean enlargement with first Greece and then Portugal and Spain joining in 1985. Then it was the so-called EFTA enlargement, which was the economic region, not maybe geographic, with Austria, Sweden, and Finland joining. Then it was the Eastern enlargement with the whole Eastern European countries joining. And then, in terms of the possible, potential future enlargements, you have two regions. One region is Balkans, or the Western Balkans, basically. And the other region is what we call, or the EU calls in this terminology, the trio region. Because it's not really a geographic region, but it's a trio in terms of a political region, and trio means Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. As the three countries of the Eastern Partnership who, unlike the other members of the Eastern Partnership, actually want and are able to do the reforms and integrate it with Europe. So basically, the decision of the EU was to open the membership path for the trio countries, and that gave the opportunity in 2022 to receive the candidate status, which Ukraine and Moldova did successfully, and Georgia did not. And if you ask me now, as I said, I will try to maintain my political neutrality, but the biggest disagreement I would have with my government, and a lot of people in Georgia would have with the government, is that the number of steps have been taken which, first of all, did not allow Georgia to get the candidate status in 2022, and we got going with a delay in 2023. I'll come back to this also later on. And then, when Ukraine and Moldova opened, or the decision was made to open accession negotiations with those two countries, Georgia missed out on that as well. And in 2024, which is this year, basically the process has been frozen. And we'll talk about this in greater detail because it's important to know why that is the case. So what happened in the last 2 years is that Georgia first received the so-called potential candidacy, which was basically the European, its European aspirations were acknowledged. It was qualified as a country which can become the member of the European Union, which, you know, according to the EU treaty, the famous for Article 49, any European country who can live up to the obligations and etc. of the European Union can become a member, so it was qualified as such country. And then in December 2023, it was given the candidate status, but obviously with the conditions that they need to be implemented. And so we are now in the situation in which currently the relations are at the lowest we've had in years, and the different reasons why that is the case. The major reason why that is the case is that we've seen a serious deterioration on the democratic path from the Georgian government. We've seen a number of steps, number of laws, number of decisions taken which directly contradict the European values. I usually hate giving the presentations, but here I brought some what do you call it, the cartoons or the photos which sort of reflect the problems that we have in the recent years. And I tried not to steal them. They are from the Journal of Time Editing, the Geopolitics, where we use this illustration. Now, this is one of the illustrations we ran a few months ago. Basically, this shows the three things which have kind of closed the doors on the further European integration for Georgia in the last months. The first of those things was the adoption of the foreign agents law. I don't know if you know this, but there is something that a lot of authoritarian countries in the world, particularly in the countries which are friendly to Russia, have been using recently, and that is attacking and demonizing civil society and dubbing them as foreign agents, basically saying that the civil society does not represent its own values or its own interests, but is actually there to represent the interests of the foreign states. And obviously when they say the foreign states, here they mean Europe and the United States. And so the foreign agents law was adopted, which is very similar to the law that Russia has adopted back in 2012, and also very similar to the other laws which have been pondered by Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, Republika Srpska, and other countries basically. There's a similar law in Azerbaijan. So the family of the laws which basically labels the non-governmental organizations as well as the media organizations who receive foreign funding as the foreign agent, and makes it impossible to work under those circumstances. To give you an example, the think tank that I founded 12 years ago and I'm still involved in managing is literally, is or was close to being wiped out basically, because either we had to register as a foreign agent and say that we actually were the foreign agents, which we didn't do or we would never do, or we had to pay the fines. And so we have now literally come to the moment that we will be fined anytime, any moment, even now, they will be fining us. And the fines are so heavy that it will basically make an organization defunct within a matter of weeks or months. And so what other organizations do in that case is that they avoid it by registering in the EU countries like in Estonia, in Italy, in Czech Republic, etc., to try to avoid that. But obviously this means that there is a heavy attack against the civil society organizations. The second thing which they did is also very similar to what a lot of authoritarian countries do, which is adopt what they call the anti-LGBT propaganda law. Even when I say it sounds absurd, but I have to say it because that's one thing which they've been advocating. And that basically says that, and that basically dwells on the notion that there is an attack from the West to impose same-sex marriage or the same-sex related laws on the society, which is Christian, traditional, Orthodox, whatever, and they are resisting it, and therefore we need to protect the majority, that's the official line, from that sort of invasion from the West. And they adopt the law, which at the end of the day, the law is a pure discriminatory law, which would be scrapped in any normal country. But obviously it's hard to do that when you have a system in which the courts are also fully controlled by the law. So that's the second one. And before getting to the third one, so these are the two laws basically which have made it impossible for Georgia to advance further on the course of European integration. And we're very clear, the European Council, which you know is the highest body in the European Union, comprising of the heads of the states, they effectively said, first in June 2024, and just now in October, that because of this, the accession process is de facto halted, is de facto suspended basically. And if you look at the statements coming from the European Union's Commissioner Designate, Marta Kloss, who will probably be dealing with the enlargement portfolio, if she survives the hearings in the European Parliament, as well as Borrell, or the incoming Kaja Kallas, who is the new HRVP in the European Union. The statements that he made that for Georgia to ever resume the relations with the European Union, at the minimum, the two things need to be done. These two laws need to be suspended, or scrapped, or abolished, or whatever you want to call it. However, having said that, and here comes the big issue, which very often people in my country, decision makers in my country, and sometimes even decision makers in the EU fail to understand, which is that you cannot only hope to undo the wrong you've done and then hope to have progress on the path up to the European Union. In other words, there will be people who will say, you know what, if Georgia actually removes these two laws, then they can move forward on the path to the European Union. But you need to look at what Georgia was told when the candidate status was given to Georgia. First, when it was conditional in 2012, 2022, and then when it was given in 2023. And I want you to look at this. These are the 12 priorities which the EU set forward for Georgia, basically saying that you need to have a progress on each of these priorities to move further. And these priorities are depolarization. I'll come back to each of them very briefly, just because I want you to, because this is the way we probably understand the Georgian internal dynamics and politics best. It will be the electoral reforms, independent judiciary, anti-corruption measures, de-oligarchization, fight against organized crime, media freedom, protection of the vulnerable groups, gender equality, civil society involvement, taking on board the ECHR judgments, and the public. I'm going to stay here for a second because this is important. Basically, what the EU said in 2022 is that it told Georgia that you need to reform to move further on the track towards the European Union. And then they identified in Brussels, and this obviously was not just the making of the European Commission, but the member states, also the European Parliament, which was very heavily involved in this process, they identified the key areas where the problem is in Georgia's either domestic or foreign policies. In 2023, they cut down this 12 into 9 areas. And I'm going to go back through those 9, which are basically the same as these 12, and I'll stay on each of them just to show you where Georgia-EU relations is from the prism of these priorities that the EU has towards Georgia. Here's the first one, the fight against disinformation. And by the way, I'm part of a group of the civil society organization which is monitoring the progress of Georgia on delivering on these priorities. And so these are the judgments that we have introduced as civil society organizations, which by the way coincide 100% with the judgment by the European Commission published just 3 weeks ago. So the fight against disinformation. So as you know, one of the biggest challenges that the European Union faces these days in its foreign policy is disinformation mainly coming from Russia and China. There's a whole big thing, basically, the FIMI, as it's called in new terminology, the foreign information manipulation interventions, who are aimed at destabilizing the situations within the political context, within the Union itself, as well as the domestic societies of the member states. And the countries are supposed to fight it. In case of Georgia, a strange thing happened, which is that the Georgian government has actually embraced the main disinformation lines that Russia is propagating and used it for its own domestic purposes, political purposes. For instance, we've probably heard one of the main propaganda lines by Russia is that it's the West who's responsible for the war in Ukraine. This is what the government has said in the Georgian domestic discourse, basically blaming the West. And I showed you this here. The statement said the second front. You probably wondered what this was. Basically, the government used the Russian line saying that the West wanted to open the second front, which is the second front line, basically, in Georgia against Russia. Because the government was preventing it from doing that, which is a complete nonsense. There's no evidence to suggest that, or there's nothing to suggest that. But it doesn't matter, because propaganda does not need to be based on the fact. It needs to be based on the propaganda machine. But there are also other propagandas. For instance, the ones that I already mentioned, about the foreign agents, about the LGBT, about how West has abandoned the countries in need, how Russia is the protector of the Christian values and things like that, which unfortunately in Georgia's case, the government has actually embraced as opposed to fighting. So EU says you need to step up the fight against disinformation and certainly not embrace it, not use it, and not proliferate. The second one that the European Union tells Georgia to do, or to have progress on, is to align with the EU Common Foreign and Security Policy. And if you look at the alignment rates of a number of states with the EU's foreign policy, what you would see is that, for instance, the Balkan states are aligning with about 90%, from 80 to 90% of the European Union's foreign policy statements and the foreign policy stances. Ukraine and Moldova are above that in 90-something percent. Georgia was at 43% and has improved this year up to, I think, 62%. And so the European Union's stance was that you need to align the foreign policy with that of the European Union. However, the one big thing what it means is aligning with the sanctions policy, as well sanctions for Russia, obviously, as well as with the support towards Ukraine more than we currently have. And that is not the case. That is not what the Georgian government has been doing. So this is another thing which we consider that this is the priority, which still needs to be fulfilled, so there is no progress there. The third one is addressing the issue of polarization. So this depolarization is the sort of the keyword that the European Union has been using very actively in the Georgian domestic political context, because what happened in Georgia in the last 12 years or so is that the society has become extremely polarized, and the political extremes have become dominating, which means that it's very hard to be either neutral or to be apolitical, and also it's the bigger problem is that this has translated into the government having the approach that if you're not supporting me, you're my enemy. And if you're my enemy, then I'm going to either dub you as a foreign agent or let you go from the work or attack you, including to the physical attack. And the problem that is proliferating is that there is literally no power sharing as a result of this. Now I understand the number of countries power sharing is not the most important or sort of, it's not a sexy thing to do, but in a number of European Union countries, there is a certain minimum level of engagement of the opposition or a minimum level of power sharing. For instance, in a number of countries you have coalition government practices, like in Germany, like in Austria, like in Italy, for instance. In a number of countries you have the opposition assuming certain roles within the parliament. In the Georgian case, the polarization has led to the point where if a party wins the elections, it needs to win everything. Including all the municipalities, all the local councils, all the government branches, all the committees in the parliament, etc. So basically it's a zero-sum game. And when it is a zero-sum game, it sort of ostracizes a big part of the population. In 2020, and this is actually a new thing also for the European Union, in 2020, after the elections that we had, there was a political crisis when the opposition decided not to enter the parliament because of the rigging of the elections, because there were a lot of violations in the election process. And the European Union did quite an unprecedented thing at that time, which is that they actually sent a mission to Georgia to negotiate a deal between different political forces. It was the European Council's president, Charles Michel, who is now outgoing, as you know, the former Belgian Prime Minister, who visited Georgia several times in 2020 and 2021 to strike a political deal between different political forces of Georgia to ensure that the opposition would join the parliament and also to ensure that the government would do certain reforms, including the power sharing and the polarization. Now, it ended dramatically, also for Mr. Michel himself, because the agreement was not implemented, neither by the government nor by the opposition, and it sort of backfired also on Michel's reputation, who did not really have good relations, for instance, with Ursula von der Leyen and the other leadership in the European Union. So it really backfired for him. And so, but the point is that the European Union attempted something which is done extremely rarely to mediate the internal political discussions of a neighboring country. At that time, by the way, also noticed that in 2021, Georgia was not yet a candidate state. So it was just the country of the Eastern Partnership program. The step number 4, which needs to be done for the progress of the election on the integration track, is to conduct free and fair elections. And that is probably the biggest problem that we have currently, because we just had elections a few weeks ago on October 26th. And the result of the election is that the government, the official result of the government is 53%, and the opposition received about 39%. But there has been a lot of irregularities and a very bad practice of practically zero confidentiality when voting. I'm sure you have all voted in your life. If not, you know that one of the basic premises of the vote is that it needs to be confidential. In other words, nobody can know who you voted for. And we had it's probably the first time in our history where we had the vote when if you circle the bulletin, you could see on the back side who you voted for. And it was used by the government very effectively to do the so-called vote control, particularly in the regions, and to use the intimidation in parallel with this control of the vote. But to cut a long story short, we come back to your questions on this. The report by the observers was extremely negative, and now the European Union is considering what to do with the outcome of these elections. So far, no European Union government has congratulated the Georgia's winning party with the election outcomes. The Foreign Affairs Council had a decision 2 days ago saying that basically they will seek international inquiry about how the elections went. And, but more importantly, all the electoral observers, including from the OSCE, have been quite critical. And so that issue remains in question, whether the step number 4 has been implemented and certainly has not been implemented, and whether this is going to affect any progress of Georgia's relations with the European Union. So the step number 5 was the parliamentary oversight of the independence of institutions, which, in addition to the problems I talked about, is a serious concern for the European Union, because in the state, you need to have institutions which are independent from the political control. And those are institutions like the election administration, like the National Bank, like the Communications Commission, because you need institutions which are impartial and which would counter if any particular political party decided to either preserve or to maximize the power at the expense of the democratic values or the human rights, etc. And so what happens in Georgia's case is that institutions which you see, as well as the next one, which is the judicial institutions, so we're going to combine these 5 and 6 into the same building block here, are completely controlled by the government and their MPs. And by the way, this is one thing you see in authoritarian leading governments throughout the world, inside the European Union as well as outside of this region, where the autocratic regimes cannot sustain themselves unless they have full control of all the state institutions, particularly the ones that deal in the media. Because, for instance, the Communication Commission is important because if you control it, you can define the critical media. You can you can adopt the regulations which make the life very hard. If you control the National Bank, what you can do is that you can use the National Bank for political purposes, like we did in the recent months. Because of a lot of black money spent in the pre-election period and the devaluation of the Georgian currency, National Bank stepped in and used the reserves so that the currency would not devalue, which in a normal case, the National Bank would not do. And so spending of the black money basically would affect the currency, which would backfire the government. And in cases like ours, that is not the case. Same goes for the election administration, which obviously was part of this sort of deal, how to rig the elections the way they were a few weeks ago. Same goes for the judiciary, which interestingly has been one of the first institutions which the ruling party in Georgia has affected, because in a society in which you have a free court, it's really hard to become authoritarian, because the court is going to curb your powers. And in the case of Georgia, the first thing they did as early as 2013, 2014, to fully control the courts. Then you have, here you have so the last second part of the sentence is the state of Illinois, which would end with the protection service, which is basically having the special investigative service with the national data protection, also independent, which is not the case, so I'll just skip this. And I'll start with number 8, because it's probably the most important one. The big problem that Georgia has is the oligarchic government. When I say oligarchic government, what I mean is that we have something similar to the practice that we've seen in Russia, in Ukraine, and in Moldova at different times. Which means that you have the person or the group of persons running the country who are also the richest persons. You've seen it in Ukraine over the years, particularly for Zelensky coming to power when he had sort of oligarchic duopolies or sort of different oligarchs running the country, maybe 3, 4, 5, depending who you consider as an oligarch. You have the same thing in Moldova, where you have one oligarch, Mr. Pahom, running the country before he was ousted through the elections. You have the similar system in Russia, but the oligarchs in Russia are centralized under the control of Mr. Putin and the state sort of hierarchy. And in Georgia, you have the oligarch, Mr. Ivanishvili, who is literally running the country using all the machinery that today is talked about. And when I say the oligarch, the reason I say the oligarch is because he is the richest person in Georgia. His personal wealth is about 5 or 6 billion, which is probably about 1/3 or 1/4 of the whole country's wealth. So you have that one person running the show, running the government, running the political party, and capturing the institutions. It's extremely hard to unseat. And so we've seen that oligarchic governments as the biggest problem in Georgia. That's why the European Union came up with the concept of de-oligarchization, which is considered to be one of the things. But by the way, nobody knows how to do. The only way you can really oligarchize is if you defeat the person in the election. But if the person stays in power, how does he oligarchize himself? It's not entirely clear. So this is considered to be one of the important requests on the side of the European Union. And the final point, which is not really the final point, but still it's an important one, is dealing with human rights and engagement with civil society, which, as I said already, has been a critical issue for the last few years. And it does not only concern the non-governmental organizations, does not only concern the media, which has been under attack also constantly, does not only concern the LGBTQ minority, but also concerns other human rights, whether it's the freedom of expression, or the freedom of association, or the rights of the national minorities, because, as I said, in the countries which are trying to become authoritarian, human rights obviously are going to be protected. So, to cut a long story short, the current relations between Georgia and the European Union are probably at the lowest that we have seen. What we have seen in the recent months is ongoing numerous protests, including, as we speak, yesterday, the day before yesterday. And for instance, here you see it's probably one of the smallest protests, not the largest one. We've had one of the protests, 150,000 people come to the country, figured it as a lot. This is a protest against the foreign agents law. And now we have a protest against the outcome of the election. So what we see now is a very dual situation in which you have the government, which has taken this clearly anti-European, anti-democracy platform. You have the population, which is 80% pro-European. In the last, constantly in the last polls, we have had people who, the number of people who support the European path and European integration is 83+%. And you have the European Union, who is in a strange situation because they have to deal with the government, which does all these anti-European steps. But you cannot fully say no to the country because they have the people who are pro-European. So that leaves the European Union in a very precarious situation. And Ronnie correctly said that it's a very interesting case right now. Probably very seldom this happens when you have the European Union trying to find the modus operandi of its relations with the country, that it has to take into account that the people think different way from the government. And somebody might ask them, how come the government is elected by these people? And there are many ways how this is done, through the election rigging, but also through the creative narratives which are being used. For instance, this is probably one of the few elections that I know in this part of the world, talking about Europe in general, which were about the geopolitical choice of the country. You probably all know this famous saying in the 90s when in the President Clinton's campaign, one of the advisors told, he wrote on the board, it's the economist saying that all this sort of election-related stuff has to be about economy, because that's what people really vote for. We in Georgia had the elections where, actually in an article, the title of the article was the foreign policy system with a question mark, because the whole campaign was about foreign policy. The opposition and civil society was arguing that this was a choice between the European and the Russian actors, and the government arguing that this was a choice between war and peace, saying that if they were voted out, Georgia would get into war with Russia, and saying that if they stayed in power, the war would not happen. So they beat the Europe versus Russia rhetorical campaign point. He beat it in the card because about war versus peace. And that is one thing that we should keep in mind, and this is my last part of this short intervention, which is the trauma that Georgia has in relation to the war with Russia, which happened in 2008. Here you see a map which I think was devised by, I think it was created by Christopher when I was working there, and I still keep this map, because it sort of shows all the attacks that Georgia was victim of in 2008. And it was the first time since the breakup of the Soviet Union when Russia used its troops outside of its territory. Russia has used its troops before inside its territory in Chechnya, but it has never left its borders. In 2008 was the first time. Now nobody is obviously surprised when Russia uses the troops outside, after Crimea, after Donbass, and after the invasion of Ukraine. But in 2008 was the first thing that they did. In Georgia, and it was a 5-day war, which left several hundred people left, many thousands wounded, and the two regions, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, occupied by Russia, and then recognized as independent states, but not yet annexed. So that's the difference. Like in the case of Crimea, they occupied it, they declared Crimea independent, and then they annexed it. And sort of formally part of Russia, and the Russian outlook. But these two regions are not yet annexed, but they are occupied with the Russian presence of several thousand troops, completely located and controlled by Russia, but still recognized as independent state by Russia and 4 other countries: Syria, Venezuela, Nauru, and I think that's it. There were 2 other countries recognized, Tuvalu and Vanuatu, but they do bear their recognitions. And it's actually, I remember back in the day when I was in the first service, one of the priorities we had was to counter the Russian recognition policy of these 2 regions. And Russia at the time had a very smart policy. They tried to approach the most vulnerable states who were either very poor or very dependent on Russia. There's such a concept in international political economy, it's called HIPC, highly indebted poor countries, mainly the African countries, but not only, obviously from Oceania also. And Russia would tell them is that they would either pay their debt or they would annul the debt to Russia either recognize it as a country. And then we had to devise the whole non-recognition policy, how that was countered by Georgia, arguing that it was not legitimate under international law, as well as by our Western partners, the European Union and the United States, also for balancing what Russia offered. And only several countries budget. For instance, Nauru budget because the president was given $50,000 on the promise to build the airport. He only received $10,000, and the airport was never built, but the recognition stayed. Same went for Tuvalu, but then Tuvalu took it back, and same went for Vanuatu. And that trauma of the war in 2008 is actually something that was used very well by the government this time in the domestic discourse, because obviously nobody likes war. And so if you're told that, you have to take a certain political choice, otherwise there will be a war, that sort of trumps the card of somebody being pro-European, pro-Western, wanting to have a democratic government and sort of European reforms. Look, I think I'm going to stop here because I'm guessing that there will be questions asked, and then I remember some things I want to talk about, but I'll come back to them as I answer the questions.
Okay.
I hope there are questions.
So, thank you very much. Thank you very much. So let's open the floor to your questions and comments, as usual. If any, yes, there is something there. The mic is coming.
the European Union, where most probably are free. So how is it in Georgia?
That's one middle. I think it's, yes. Good. There are a lot of interesting parallels with Moldova, also differences with Moldova. So, the one thing in the Georgian case is that, unlike in Moldova, where you can have an on-the-record pro-Russian political party or politician like Dodon, for instance, who can campaign on a pro-Russian platform and hope to get the votes, also in the regions like Belarus. In Georgia, you cannot do that. So in Georgia, if there is a political party which campaigns openly on a pro-Russian platform, saying the same things which Jordan would say or any Moldovan politician, they would get not more than 5%. So that's not so. And also one of the reasons for that is that even though we have national minority dominated regions in the south, there are Armenian and Azerbaijan minorities, we do not really have the so-called Russian minority or like Russian dominated. It's heavily occupied. The occupied regions do not go. So we don't have that. So because of that, the subtlety of Georgia's situation is that the pro-Russian will say. So the government is doing therefore is that they have embraced the Russian propaganda narratives. They have embraced literally all the talking points. They have received the praise from Moscow on a number of occasions, constantly, saying that look how good Georgia is acting. They have resisted the West. They have demonized the Western politicians, including the friends from the European Parliament, the Commission, etc. They've made a boogeyman out of the Global War Party, which, when asked who that is, they couldn't answer. They said it is the Global War Party that will regulate the war, and that is basically the European Union and the US, who exactly is sort of pinpoint to that. So this is the difference. There's one major commonality though with Moldova, and I'm actually working with Moldovan colleagues now to write an article about that. That is how pro-Russian forces actually weaponize support for the political purposes. And I think one thing we saw in Moldova and Georgia is that because you ask who is supporting some of the socially the European. So when I say 80%, that is visible, that is cross-cut. The younger generation always do more than the older one, but also this pretty much no divide whether it's rural or urban or whatever, just to have high support. But there's one major difference. If you are poorer, you're more susceptible to the pressure. And so what we saw in Moldova, when we saw the Russian money being used for the bribes to vote against the referendum, as well as what we saw in Georgia, at the institutional level, is that the poverty is used for the pro-Russian and the Western and European purposes. That's one major thing that we actually have in common.
Any questions or comments?
We'll come back to that actually. Very good shape.
I'm Lord from Tbilisi, and I am actually what does the European Union Georgia has about the European Union, and I need in the sense that the European Union has the right to, let's say, try to do analysis in the Union that let's say some regions that claim the independence for Russia. What does the European Union do? We need to understand it's a small, relatively low social impact. Why the European Union is obligated to include the European Union?
That's a very good question. That's one of the questions I asked out of my, I would not say board, one of the European Commission high-level officials, close negotiations when it was starting. And that's exactly what I said, that you literally asked the same question I asked him or her, saying that, so why are you guys interested in Georgia? Like, the other side of the Black Sea, as conflict regions, economic zones were not in market. So I understand why we're interested in Ukraine. I would understand why we're interested in Poland, in Romania, etc. And I got a response, which I will repeat to you, because I have a different answer to that. The response I got was, had you really been operating with that sort of rational, consequentiality-based standard what we get in return, then Cyprus would never become a member of the EU. And if you think about it, it makes sense. It's also a small country, also has a territorial problem with the North Cyprus, the topic, as a Greek also probably know about this. Economically, I mean, come on, it's not a big thing. And what does it bring to the table? So the answer that I got at that time was that it's a matter of two things. The first one is that if the European Union is enlarged to a region, the policy is not to leave out any country of the region, because that way you sort of promote stability and prosperity more. So that's one. And obviously, as it was the Eastern enlargement, you couldn't leave out Malta or Cyprus or any other country which, separately speaking, would not bring much to the table. But because it was part of a wider region, it was like a package deal, let's put it this way. Otherwise, what justified Malta being in the European Union within the same logic? But the second one was democracy. I think that's what the biggest sort of answer is, because the question that you asked, if it had been, if you're talking about a country who's also authoritarian, and with all the problems that you just mentioned, there is no justification. But if it's a democracy with the people who want European integration, then, and it does not create major problems for the European Union in terms of economy, etc., then it can be justified. And so, but the European Union's approach for years is that it does not work with, does not accept countries which are authoritarian. Starting all the way from the 60s, when first they refused France not to go, and then when they refused Greece to go. And the reason why they opened the door for Greece was that the authoritarian regime was changing democracy. And at that time, by the way, the only case in the history of European integration you might know is that in Greece, the European Commission had a negative opinion about the regime, and the country decided positively. And the reason for that was that, yeah, it's a country on the continent, democratic, and needed that sort of approach. So, but to cut my long answer short is that a democratic European country which wants membership and is ready to reform, as I understand, gets a green light from the European Union. The other question is the conflict, and the conflict is something which is an important thing to factor in, because the Cypriot example showed that you can have the accession without a common constitution, and the accession might not lead to the common constitution. And so you can have different models how that can be treated there. And there will be at least three models. I think one would be the Cypriot model, which is basically you saying that the country is a member of the EU. I recognize the territorial integrity, but the acquis communautaire is suspended on the territory which is not controlled, like the Northern Cyprus. The second approach would be like in the case of Greenland. Is anybody from Greenland here? Probably not. Denmark, where in the case of Greenland and Denmark, Greenland is considered to be as part of Denmark, but it's not part of the European Union. In other words, it's not no acquis applies to Greenland because they decided to go. Or it could be like Kosovo in the future. I would say this now, because we don't know what's going to happen in Kosovo, etc. As you know, today Kosovo has been on the path of European integration, with having at least 5 member states who are not recognizing its independence. And still, this is impossible. So I know what's going to happen in 10 years, in 7 years, but it could also be another, with a viable, I don't know, but some sort of one. European Union is designed by 8 states, meaning that actually quite often, very ridiculous as of the EU. So when they introduce 12 priorities, so this is not what you might think when you take into account the CHR judgment. This is not meaning that you have to implement the CHR judgment. That's not the thing. What it means is that the Georgian judicial system, it was not mandatory to use the CHR case law as a reference point. Because we don't have a precedent-based legal system, so it didn't, so that's not mandatory. However, the government did, and they introduced the law at the Bible level that when a judge issues a judgment, they have to refer. It's not necessary to agree to it or to use it as a precedent, they have to refer. So the problem with this was that this was just a technical thing to do. So this is not to say that Georgia is fulfilling all these judgments, because that had been the case, we would have never adopted the law for ages. The law for ages that was adopted in Russia was struck down by the European Court. So that's not what we do. It means that we create the instrument through which the judges and the courts can refer in their judgments and their articulations to the decisions of the CHR. But the very the mistake there is that if you look at this initial 12 things, there are some of them which are huge, like temporization, requires a lot of reforms. Or like anti-corruption, like the scale is very big. And then you have the number 11, which usually requires one small bylaw. And very technical. Or you have gender equality, which also was interpreted in terms of technicality, basically passing a law or changing something in the law. And so we consider this to be mostly fulfilled because it leads to the technical stuff. But as we talk about gender equality, we still have the handicaps, we still have the discrimination, we still have what we call the offense side, the cases where the woman is killed because of the movement, basically. And so when it comes to gender equality, it's a checkpoint, but it's not really there. So that's why, and then in the next 9, which I went through, ridiculously, the EU made more sort of program. But it's not technical, but it's like a bigger So these 9 that I went through here, we look at the report. By the way, that's the same approach in the other countries' cases as well. This 9 is actually over 130 complete requirements. This is 9 sort of baskets, a lot of very concrete things that we do.
Okay. Are there other questions?
Okay. Let's do the time. We still have time, right? I can continue with the other thing. That's all they do. Okay. So, two other things I wanted to add, which is about the role of the European Union. Because obviously you start with EU foreign policy, and there is the case where EU foreign policy has invested on a number of occasions. And so two of the things is how the European Union deals with the conflict that we have with Russia. So the two ways of that is done. One is through the monitoring mission of the European Union on the ground. As you know, the European Union has a number of ESDP missions, the security and defense policy, gives the opportunity to the EU to deploy the military, civilian, or mixed missions. And in Georgia's case, we've had the deployment of a civilian mission, but it is monitoring of the ceasefire mission. That means that we have about, depending on the year, 200 to 300 monitors who are located at the boundary line of the occupied regions. Even though the mandate provides that they can also enter and do the monitoring inside, but the Russians don't allow. So they monitor the ceasefire, they monitor the security situation on the ground. We actually have 300 people from the European Union wearing the EU armbands and the cars with the UNM license plates, who regularly do the patrolling and the monitoring around the boundary lines of these two regions. that's one way in which the European Union is involved. The other way is that the European Union currently is a co-chair of the only dialogue process we have with Russia and with the representatives of Kazakhstan. So when I was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, I used to be the head of the Georgia delegation in these negotiations with Russia over Kazakhstan. I took part in 21 rounds, and this was probably one of the challenges in my memoirs for sure. The strangest negotiations I've been to. In any case, what the European Union does since 2008 is that it has assumed the role of a sort of a peace broker between Georgia and Russia and with these occupied regions. Now, that is not what the EU has traditionally done in the case of Georgia, or for that matter, in the case of the whole region in South Caucasus, or even in the East. So, if you look at the early 2000s or the late 90s, when the conflicts were there, the EU's role was pretty much non-existent. So in the 90s, when we had the war in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, there's a famous story how our ambassador wrote to one of the EU officials and complains about how the Russians have taken over the Abkhazia and the official is drinking a coffee and putting a croissant in it and eating it, and says, so basically, they didn't go, they didn't have any instruments or any kind of ways of doing that. By 2008, they did intervene diplomatically, because basically the war was stopped with the diplomatic intervention of Sarkozy, because the French presidency knew at that time, as well as the American community, but it was a diplomatic deal which was signed with the participation of the European Union. As my friend who was the mayor of Sarajevo when the war in Bosnia took place, he joked that when the war was in Bosnia, it took even 5 years to respond, and the war broke out in Georgia, it took even 5 days to respond. What progress? I mean, yeah, from 5 years to 5 days, it is progress. Anyway, the thing is that that's the new thing that the EU has been doing in the last 15 years or so. And in Georgia, there have been two types of interventions. One, in the case of peace process, and the other one on the ground, the EU monitoring mission. Now, since then, the EU has proliferated also the other parts. For instance, EU has now recently deployed the EU assistance mission in Armenia, where it monitors the ceasefire after the takeover of the return of the Nagorno-Karabakh by Azerbaijan. It has now deployed the mission also in Ukraine, which provides not just the military aid, it also provides the assistance of the reforms to Ukraine. And by the pioneer of the February Moldova, where the EU has deployed the EU border assistance mission in 2003 or 2004, when the border of Transnistria and Ukraine, the EU monitors still allocating, by the way, to ensure that there is no contraband, there is no smuggling, and the border is controlled more effectively. So that's one thing I want to say, which is that the European Union's role in the peace process in the case of Georgia. Now, the criticism of this always is also possible because unlike the real peace negotiations like it was in the case of Cyprus or in the case of Northern Ireland or in the case of even Bosnia for that matter, where you had a negotiator with a dedicated mandate to strike a peace deal, successful in the case of Dayton in Bosnia, and also successful in the case of Annan plan in Cyprus or the Castellani agreement in the case of Cyprus, but successful in the case of the Good Friday agreement in Rhode Island. In Georgia's case, what we don't have is a sort of political weight behind the negotiators and the sufficient level of engagement. So in the case of the Georgian negotiations, we have the EU's special representative, who is Zurich, who is not a high-ranking political figure, who is not does not have the resources, does not have the political backing to be either too creative or too pushy, and so they have to find some kind of the lowest common denominator here. So that's the biggest criticism that you can have now with regard to this engagement. But if you compare it to what it was doing before, certainly it's a huge point. So I remember when I was first starting to deal with the occupied regions, the first peace talks I took in part I was in Georgia, and on the other side of the table there was Russia as a mediator, South Ossetia as a party, and also North Ossetia. I was like, well, even the same, why are you like free everyone? Because neither the university nor the EU, nor the United States, nor any other international partner involved. So that's one thing I want to mention. The other thing which I also think is important to mention is that the European Union has, particularly after providing the candidate status to Georgia, has engaged in the conditionality-driven relations. And I think the major difference between the previous stages of those relations with the European Union and the current stage is precisely that. The EU is now ready to use its money, to use its political willpower, as well as to use its sort of pressure on its neighborhood government, or even to engage in a way in the domestic political discourse to deliver, to have the government deliver on the reforms. I'm going to show you one thing which came out just recently by the European Union's delegation to Georgia. Here, look at this slide. It's very interesting slide because it shows. Here, look what it says. If you look at this slide, you would not, you would guess why is it interesting. It says basically that in 1924, from 2019 to 2024, the EU has allocated 500 million euros to the public administration and the ministries of Georgia, and 46 million to the civil society. You know why this is interesting, why they issued this? Because this was in response to the government of Georgia's claim that the EU has spent most of its money on civil society, and the civil society was therefore a foreign agent, or agent of the European Union. They responded to this infographic, and the ambassador during the speech clarified, saying that actually what the government is saying is untrue, because in fact they spent more money on the ministry than they spent on the civil society. So if the point is that probably the EU money is even agent, the government is agent, no, they actually didn't money. But the point here is that the EU has recently started, at least in the case of Georgia, certainly is also in the case of the law in Ukraine, applying this sort of conditionality law, saying that if you don't deliver on the reforms, we're not going to give you money. If you faster the reforms, we're going to give you more assistance. If you use the if you go against the democratic principles, etc., then we might even suspend the talks or suspend the track towards the European Union. So basically, this is now the time when the European Union has switched from the socialization approach, where it's basically the idea that you do the reforms that you want or consider important that are going to help you, to the stage where they say, this is what you need to do. You better do it, otherwise there will be consequences. And we see these consequences. Also in the financial assistance, for instance, we have recently the European Union has suspended about 120 million of aid to the government and is now considering to reallocate its aid to the civil society. 2 years ago, we had a suspension of 60 million loan because of the problems with the judiciary. And that is one thing that the EU has learned to do in the recent years, which was not the case before. Not only to the Georgia, but also to the EU. So I've studied extensively the Eastern Arm of the European Union in early colleges. There was a conditionality applied, but the conditionality was nowhere nearly as robust as it is now to the countries of the Eastern Partnership. I think some people think it's unfair. I say it is. Because it goes before, otherwise you cannot simply hold the world into the European Union. Maybe I can pause here and maybe some questions have emerged. Or you just speak up.
How did Russia manage to switch the public opinion? 2008, when there was a war, and then suddenly now we have a lot of political parties, Georgian Dream, who kind of align themselves with Russia. Is it just because of oligarchs and the media, or was there a bigger push?
So So the question is, those who didn't hear, how did Russia manage to affect the public opinion, especially after the war, when you have now a government who is sort of more inclined to Russia? There are two things the Russia does. So step by step. The first one is that the more a country is dependent on Russia economically, the more susceptible it is for different kinds of pressures. In 2012, before this government came to power, Georgia's trade with Russia was at a minimum level, mainly because Russia had embargoed Turkey. And since then, the trade has increased up to 25%. Now, when the trade increases, economically we become dependent in particular segments on the Russian market. And that means that because your wealth is dependent on the money coming in from Russia, it does not immediately affect the political choices, but it does have influence. So for instance, in Georgia's case, which is a wine-making country, as you might know, Eastern Georgia, which is producing most of the wine, is selling a large part of this produced wine to Russia. And so, obviously, because of that dependence, you become older. That's one. The second one is that it's the disinformation propaganda. So, we have been, as part of my organization, think tank for us, we've been doing the monitoring of the Russian propaganda and disinformation in Georgia for many years now. And what we see is that the disinformation is very smartly targeted on those who are most susceptible. And this disinformation can be anything. It does not have to be a high politics disinformation. It can be something like McDonald's serves human flesh. And anybody would be stupid to believe it. But when you read this 100 times, 1,000 times in social media, in print, somebody hear it on TV, and it comes in conjunction with how bad West is, how bad Western food is. So it's not about McDonald's serving human flesh, which is important. It's the context in which it is important. So what happens is that with this disinformation, what Russia manages to achieve in a number of countries is not to show that they are good, but to show that everybody is bad. So that there's a moral equivalence, let's say, between Ukrainians who are fighting for their survival, the Westerners who are helping them, and Russians who are losing them. There's no truth. That's the point. And when that is the case, and when people, because of this info, of the disinformation, because of this sort of flooding, they become more susceptible to the change of their position. And the final point here is that, as I said previously, the government does not campaign around for Russia. They don't say that. What they say is that vote for us or Russia is going to attack us. And we're able to sustain, make sure that Russia does not attack us, that there's peace, because we are the best for that. Which effectively means that they are friends with Russia. But it's not framed in those terms, it's framed in terms of, do you want to see your kids die in the streets? That's all. And so the traumas of the past are exploited really well. Which, by the way, is the case also in many other countries. I know that in the case of Serbia, the traumas of the 90s are exploited really well to talk about the age of the Western countries. But obviously, the biggest problem in our case, particularly, is that it is done to the detriment of the countries of the region. So that's one way to answer the question.
Thank you. Okay, maybe the last one from the audience.
So what's happening now is the following. The election outcome got accepted by the opposition party. They said they're going to vote the parliament. They're not going to enter. The civil society people protesting. The European Union and Americans not acknowledging the results so far. That's the case. That's on this side. On the other side, the Persian group says we have the official results. They're going to convene the first parliamentary session this month, the next Monday. The hope is that they will get first recognition or the congratulations from some countries. They already got the congratulations from Orban, from Erdogan, from Malia, and I think from Armenia, still at stake. No other European Union and the they hope they will get some sort of phone call that it is Trump, and that will break it. So I'm talking about the sort of the real politics which is happening right now. And on Monday, what's going to happen most likely is that there will be an attempt to legitimize the election results in the parliament during the first session, and an attempt to prevent it from outside. Now, what that leads to is everybody's guess. Would lead to a clash, would lead to one side winning or the other side winning, but we're sort of heading, it's like a collision course. It's going to happen this Monday, like literally in a few days. And so, your question also must agree after that. The answer to that will depend on how the Monday goes. So, the highly likelihood, if you ask me, is that the government will come in the first session, there will be a clash, they will arrest the people, they will still legitimize the results, which will not be recognized by most of the states. And what happens then is that there will be sort of legitimacy crisis for the next months to come. And the next election we have is in 2025, which will be the mayoral elections. This, by the way, the electoral cycles that we've had recently. And so we have the next election in 2025, where Tbilisi mayor will be a major thing for reps, stages will post up for reps. And if nothing changes before that, the opposition will have to compete in those elections. Otherwise, if they don't compete, they will basically disappear, right? And we have no presidential election anymore because the government abolished that. The government is being by the parliament. There's also another sort of lesson learned from the authoritarian governments. They want less elections, not more. The less people you have to choose, the less there is